Scary night alone in the haunted graveyard. The sound of my own breathing echoed in my ears as I made my way through the rows and rows of headstones. The full moon hung ominously in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows that danced around me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with every step I took deeper into the graveyard. I'd come here alone tonight, drawn by an inexplicable urge to spend Halloween night in the oldest and most haunted part of town. This place was known locally as the Whispering Pines Cemetery. It was said to be the final resting ground for over 1,000 souls, each with their own story, their own secrets, and some, it was rumored, their own ghosts. As I walked, the wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves that carpeted the ground. It sounded like whispers, like voices trying to communicate with me from beyond the grave. My rational mind told me it was just the wind, but a small part of me could unhelp but wonder if there was something more to these sounds. The cemetery was old, very old. Many of the gravestones were worn and weathered, their inscriptions barely legible. Some had fallen victim to the relentless passage of time, reduced to fragments. Others had been victims of vandalism, perhaps by teenagers looking for a thrill, or by those who simply didn't care. But amidst the decay and destruction, there were a few newer graves. Stark reminders of lives cut short, or simply of the ongoing cycle of birth, death, and remembrance. I stopped at one of these newer graves. The inscription read, "Here lies Sarah Williams, 198020003. A beautiful soul, taken too soon." As I stood there, a sudden gust of wind sent a shiver down my spine. I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness, as if the spirit of Sarah herself was standing beside me, sharing her sorrow. It was at that moment that I realized I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw a figure standing at the edge of the path. Tall and thin, it seemed to be made of the very shadows of the night. Fear froze me in my tracks. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was stuck, paralyzed by a terror that went beyond anything I'd ever experienced before. Then the figure moved. It took a step towards me, then another. With each movement, it became clearer, taking on a more solid form. And with that clarity came recognition. I knew this woman. I had seen her face before, but where? Why did her eyes look so vacant, so full of despair? She was close now, within a few feet of me. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was like the rustling of dead leaves, dry and brittle. "Help me," she whispered, her words catching on the wind and disappearing into the darkness. Please help me." Terror gave way to confusion, and then to a strange sense of calm. I knew I should be afraid, but instead I found myself reaching out to the woman, trying to touch her, to help her. But when my fingers brushed against hers, they went right through. She was a ghost, a spirit trapped between this world and the next. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The ghost looked at me, her eyes filled with an ancient sorrow. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice echoing with the sound of 1,000 whispers. "My name is Sarah." I knew then that this was Sarah Williams, the girl whose grave I had stumbled upon earlier. But how was she still here? What was keeping her spirit bound to this place? More figures began to appear, drawn to us by some unseen force. I recognized them as well. They were the other souls buried here, each with their own story, their own pain, their own unfinished business. There was Thomas Blackwood, the young man who had died in a tragic car accident. Mary Clayton, the elderly woman who had passed away peacefully in her sleep. And John Riley, the Civil War soldier whose body had never been recovered. They all gathered around me, their presence growing stronger with each passing moment. At first it was overwhelming, a cacophony of whispers and wails. But as I stood there in the center of the ghostly gathering, something strange happened. The fear that had been gripping me began to melt away, replaced by a deep sense of peace. It was as if these spirits, these souls that had once walked the earth as living, breathing people, were sharing their stories, their pain, their regrets. And in that sharing, I found a strange solace. I learned of Thomas Blackwood's undying love for his family, of Mary Clayton's passion for gardening, and of John Riley's bravery in the face of adversity. And then there was Sarah. I learned of her dreams, her hopes and her fears, the things that had brought her joy, and the things that had caused her pain. I listened to their stories, and with each story, I felt a connection to these souls growing stronger. As the night wore on, the ghostly figures began to fade, their forms becoming more translucent, until they were nothing more than wisps of smoke against the backdrop of the moonlit sky. One by one, they disappeared, leaving me alone in the graveyard with only the sound of my own breathing and the rustle of the wind through the trees. And then, as suddenly as they'd come, they were gone. The whispering stopped, the shadows retreated, and the moon climbed higher in the sky. I stood there for a long time, the silence pressing in on me like the walls of a tomb. Finally, when the first hint of dawn began to paint the sky, I turned and walked away from the Whispering Pines Cemetery. As I made my way through the rows of headstones, I couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. I had come to this place seeking scares, but what I had found instead was a connection to the human experience, to the joys and sorrows, the dreams and regrets that had bound these souls to this place. I thought about Sarah, about her dreams and her hopes, and I wondered if she, along with the other spirits, had found peace in sharing their stories. I hoped that they had, that they were finally free to move on to whatever lay beyond this world. As I reached the gates of the cemetery, I turned for one last look. The sky was now awash with the colors of dawn, and the tall pines stood silhouetted against the rising sun. It was a beautiful sight, serene, peaceful, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the spirits of the Whispering Pines were watching me. As I left their stories echoing in my ears, their presence lingering at the edge of my senses. The day after my visit to the cemetery, I found myself thinking about the spirits I had met, about their stories, their joys, and their sorrows. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been changed by my experience, that I had learned something profound about life and death, about the human condition. But what exactly had I learned? Was it the acceptance of death, the understanding that it is a natural part of the cycle of life? Or was it the realization that our stories, our joys and sorrows, are what make us human, what connect us to one another, living or dead? I wasn't sure. But as the days passed and the memory of that night faded into the background of my thoughts, I couldn't help but feel that I was a better person for having experienced it. A person who understood more deeply the nature of life and death, of joy and sorrow, of love and loss, and ultimately of hope. Hope that even in death there is beauty. Hope that even in sorrow there is peace. And hope that even in the darkest of nights the sun will rise again.